Much. It's a great joy to see all of you here. Many I have been meeting over these last days, others I am seeing for the first time. And I've been in India now for 6 weeks, not for the first time in India, but on this particular lecture tour. And it has been an increasing, enjoyment for me to be able to learn. Anyway, I was saying, over these 6 weeks, what started out to be sort of an adventure for me to learn to speak these universal truths in a way that could be enjoyed by people in this country. I've been teaching in America for many, many years. It's now just become for me a way of life, and I'm very happy to be here with you all at this time. Keshava said a little bit about my background, that I have been, since the age of 22, a devoted student and follower of a direct disciple of Paramhansa Yogananda. Yogananda's autobiography of a yogi, first published in 1946, is the best-selling autobiography of all times, and even now regularly makes it on the bestseller list in any one of the 30 languages into which it has been translated. It is quite appropriate for India to be exceedingly proud of that gift to the West, because Yogananda's autobiography, in a true sense, has really launched a spiritual revolution, starting in America but spreading around the world, and continues to inspire and to guide that revolution. And a great deal of the change that we see happening in the world today, not just technology, but a change of heart, a change of consciousness, which has not yet fully taken hold. What we see now is more a conflict between old and new ways of thinking. But those new ways of thinking are gaining ascendancy, and the undying tradition of India, and also its most recent expression through Yogananda, have been largely responsible for that. Swami Kriyananda is now 86 years old. I'm sure many of you have seen him. He's been spoken in the Delhi area at least once or twice or 3 times every year when he comes. And as an American, disciple of an Indian master, having lived in India, he lives in India now, has lived here before, we're all getting all mixed up, which is just as it ought to be. Yogananda predicted that eventually, as he put it, the whole world would turn brown, that the dark-skinned people would intermarry a little with the white with the dark, and we'd all end up a beautiful shade of tan, and this whole issue of race and culture would begin to dissolve. In higher ages, it's a global culture. Right now we see ourselves moving toward that. Not all the elements of the global culture are the most admirable ones, but we are unifying as a planet, and that is all to the good. At the same time, as we all well know, there are forces fighting as strongly against that as they are fighting for it. And those of us with this expanded vision, whatever our country or culture or background, have a greater responsibility than ever to live by these high ideals. And what I'm here to talk to you about, under the title of Life Lessons, is to try to turn some of these ideas into very accessible, practical thoughts that on a daily basis we can actually utilize. Because one of the greatest challenges of the spiritual life is not merely to understand it in a theoretical way, but also to understand it in a practical way. What can I do? Obviously, we talk about meditation, but even the best of us who meditate still end up with lots of extra hours in the day. And many people, however sincere their desire to meditate, don't find in their life an easy opportunity to do it, or when the opportunity comes, they find that their own mind has come in with them and it's not necessarily so easy to do. So one of the benefits of the teaching of Yogananda, especially as Swami Kriyananda has interpreted and expressed it, is from the beginning, one of the ideals that Yogananda had was that in this day and age, what we needed was not merely ashrams where renunciates could go, but what he called world brotherhood colonies, intentional communities, where people from all the stages of life could live lives dedicated to the divine purpose. And Swami Kriyananda particularly has been inspired by this ideal and has dedicated the last 50 years of his life to the building of these communities. There are 9, I believe 9 now, including what's coming up in India, in Pune, and to a certain extent what we're doing in this area, only we're just beginning. My entire spiritual life from the age of 23 has taken place in the context of one of these communities, 2 of them. First, the original community, Ananda Village in the hills of California, then the second one that my husband and I later started ourselves and have led since that time. The characteristic of these communities are, as I was saying, that it is an integrated way of life. We're no longer thinking that spirituality is something that happens on this side, and then the rest of the life is what happens on this side. I go to my office, I go to my meditation room, I walk out of it, I go to my office. I go to my puja room, I go back to my kitchen, I take care of my family. And then I ask God every so often to help me, but the only time I'm really doing spiritual practice is when I'm meditating or doing an arati or a ceremony of some type. But that is really not the true understanding of what spiritual life is. And the true understanding of what spiritual life is the word life. In this sense, what God is asking of us is exactly what we're asking of ourselves, which is the purpose of our lives is to experience who and what we really are, which is a state of unconditioned bliss, of complete, fearless understanding, of divine guidance, of the awareness that the journey, the life that we're living is a journey that goes on and on until we attain the same state of self-realization that all the great masters of India have held out to us. In the course of time, the clarity of that teaching has been muddled up a little bit in both East and West, and we've become involved with a lot of rituals, East and West, priestly intercessions, dogmas, institutions, and we're losing a little bit of the simple fact that what God wants of us is that we enter into a state of complete joy. And we're beginning to lose touch a little bit. We have lost touch a little bit about whether that's possible and how to attain it. One of the reasons Yogananda recommended communities is because the community has to take care of every aspect of life. You have married people who need to earn a living. You have children being born who have to be raised and educated. You have individuals of all different temperaments and all different stages of spiritual development. We're not working just with complete renunciates who can just go live in a cave. And so what we've had to work with all these years is how to take the highest principles and understand how they express even in the smallest ways. And in other words, to restore to everyday life a sense of direction. As a young girl, when I was searching for the spiritual path without any context at all, growing up in America, there was nothing particular to feed me. But I had this overwhelming desire, as I can look back on it now, to find a way to integrate my life. I felt very fragmented. There was what I would call my personal life, my professional life, my artistic life, maybe a little bit of a religious life, but somehow I seemed to think it was all one story, but no one could explain to me how it all fit together until I was fortunate enough to discover Sanatana Dharma, first through Swami Vivekananda's writings, then through meeting Swami Kriyananda, Paramhansa Yogananda, and the path that I've been on ever since. The way I've come to understand it is what I want to share with you tonight. A very key word on the spiritual path. We don't even have to talk about God. We can just talk about our own consciousness and our experience of our own consciousness. If we look at life, even from infancy, we realize that progress in life is always defined by an ever-expanding state of awareness, greater and greater awareness. Just think of a little child learning. I remember when a friend of mine, I went to visit a friend, and her son was about 2 years old at that time. He didn't quite have language, but he was able to scurry all over the house, and as children of that age are, he could communicate a lot. I came into the house, and he was absolutely determined to show me what to him was one of the greatest discoveries he'd made thus far in his 24 months of life. And he dragged me upstairs, and he took me into his bedroom, and he pulled out the bottom drawer, and in the bottom drawer, all his little socks were folded. He pointed to his socks, and he looked at me, and he just screamed with all the enthusiasm, "Socks!" like that. "Yeah, those are your socks." I'm trying to enter in with him. "Yes, those are your socks." Then he looks at me with an expression that says, "You're not going to believe this." He closes the drawer. Then he makes sure he has my whole attention. He opens it again, and then he says, "Socks!" just like this. Somehow or another, he'd figured out that even though it was closed and they disappeared, every time you opened it, the socks were in the drawer. Now, for a 2-year-old child, trying to make sense out of this incredibly chaotic world, this for him was a tremendous move forward. And truthfully, upon such revelations, gradually a whole life is built. You know, you find out that you pick up the spoon and that you can't really get the food. Well, you all don't pick up a spoon, but you pick up the food, and you really can't get it in through your forehead, right? Like this, and you really can't get it in through your ear. The child gradually figures out where his mouth is. He becomes aware of the fact that there's a relationship here. He realizes if he hits the water glass like this, it falls on the floor. If he picks it up carefully, it can go into his mouth. Then, of course, he learns to read, he learns to ride his bicycle, perhaps to swim. He goes to school and he finds out that if he picks up the toy and whacks the other kid on the head with it, other children won't want to play with him. Now that's something worth learning, isn't it? If you behave that way, you'll always be alone. And when we go to school, become adults, get into business, perhaps get married, we become aware more and more of what actions bring us the result that we want, what attitudes give us a happy heart, and what things do not. Now, many people reach a certain state of awareness and figure that's enough. You know, I'm married now. Why should I be nice to you? You're already my wife, or you're already my husband. You know, I mean, we all have either been guilty of saying that or have been the unfortunate recipient of that. Why do you treat me like that? You didn't treat me like that before we were married. Yes, but now we were married. Why would I treat you differently now? We lack the awareness that actions have consequences, and some people have a desire to continue to grow, and others just draw an arbitrary line and decide that's enough. And some people become old when they're 25, and some people live to 90 and are still as fresh and youthful as they were when they were 10. There was a couple that I knew, very good friends of mine, and they were an interesting contrast in that. They were both in their early 80s, and she was absolutely in the present. She would talk to her grandchildren about what they were actually doing. She would be very interested in the unusual things that they were participating in that she had never even considered doing. the husband in that household, although a very dear and good man, had drawn a line at a certain point, and he felt like he'd had enough experience in his life, and anything new that was brought in, instead of him walking out to meet it, he tried to bring it back into the world he knew. And so all conversation would eventually circle back to him repeating what he already had experienced, and everyone would respectfully, and not always, you weren't always bored, some of it was interesting, but it was always the limit of where he was going to expand his awareness. He was finished. And she was just as alive as ever, reaching out. My uncle was 95 when he passed away. The last few years of his life, his mind was not working as well as it had worked earlier. He had been a brilliant man, an engineer, but a bit of an arrogant fellow, and pretty convinced that in any situation he knew better than anyone else, and he never hesitated to make that point of view known. He had many fine qualities, but respect for others was not necessarily one of them. And when his mind began to fragment a little bit, he used to like to repeat certain stories of when everybody else had made a mess of it and he was the only one who knew and they didn't listen to him. And there was still a lot of feeling in these stories. And he wasn't completely out of touch with reality, he was just sort of semi-out of touch. So after he told me for the 10th or 12th time one of these incidences, when his mind was more open, I said to him, do you like just reliving over and over again the things you're angry about? And he looked at me like, how stupid could you get? And he said, yes, just like that, which of course just made me laugh. There was nothing to say. If that was his idea of a fine way to spend an afternoon, well, that was the limit of his awareness. He didn't understand that there was a sweeter kind of happiness on the other side of it. Now, the example of the self-realized masters, of the great saints, of the advanced souls, even of the noble people who don't necessarily qualify on that level of spirituality, can set a very high bar for us of the possibility of expanding awareness. In fact, the question is really there. Is there any limit to how far we can expand our awareness? And in fact, Paramhansa Yogananda was asked the question once, is there any end to evolution? He said, no, evolution continues until you achieve endlessness, which is to say, until your consciousness becomes infinite. And this is the example that the avatars and the masters have set for us all along. Now, the difficulty when we come down from that level to my life in Silicon Valley, your lives in Delhi, to our jobs in the office, to our responsibilities for our families, all these different questions, is how do we take these abstractions and actually understand how to apply them? And in an even more complicated way, sometimes it's hard even to tell which way is forward. And especially at a transition time such as the one we're in, where we still have these strong images in our minds that ordinary worldly responsibilities by definition interfere with our spiritual life. You know, I'd love to leave everything behind and just go to the Himalayas, or go live in an ashram, but instead I have husband, children, job, money, all these different things. And we've set up in our minds this contradiction between the possibility of spiritual growth and the maintaining of our God-given responsibilities. That is specifically the seeming conflict that Paramhansa Yogananda and even more Swami Kriyananda have been born to resolve. And that's what I want to speak to you about now. Speak about to you now. Odd, I couldn't get those words together. There's a beautiful sequence. Okay, here, let me just add one more point to this before I get specific. There's another very helpful point to keep in mind about spiritual growth. We tend to think of spiritual development or personal development or an increase in awareness as a very either-or sort of thing. Either I've left everything behind and I'm living for God, or I'm a worldly person and I'm trapped in these circumstances. One of the ways that Yogananda has made this personal evolution more practical is with a simple word, and that word is directional. It isn't an absolute that I either am this way or I am not this way. It's a question of from where I am standing, how do I move forward? Where in this vast horizon of choices is my goal, and how can I move toward that goal? Now, a lot of time people resist the idea of spiritual growth being directional for a lot of peculiar ideas, not the least of which is, if spiritual growth is directional, that means that there is always something I could do now. And sometimes it's much more convenient to just imagine that I'll do it someday, or to imagine that it's closed to me, but to actually realize that our evolution, spiritually and personally, is entirely in our hands right now, and that nothing prevents us from moving toward it except our own unwillingness to do so. And there are many reasons why we have that unwillingness. I'll explore it in just a moment. There's another aspect to this word directional, which is very important to understand. Just before I left home in California, someone gave us a gift, and it was a bulb, a flower bulb, a hyacinth bulb, that of course is going to grow into a hyacinth. And it was planted in this little glass vase in which you could watch the roots grow down into the water and see the green shoots come up from the top. Now, the hyacinth is going to be, I will have missed its life, but it would have been beautiful. I think it was a pink color, it has an elegant shape, has a beautiful fragrance. It's going to look really beautiful sitting on the windowsill. The bulb, however, is not particularly attractive. It's a sort of knobby brown thing. There's very little in the bulb that in fact resembles at all the hyacinth that's going to come out of it. And sitting in the water, I watched all the little roots. The days that I was there, they started coming. Then the little green began to come out, and then a little tiny hint of the pink. Because I was leaving for 8 weeks, and I was eager to enjoy the hyacinth, I was urging it on, seeing if it could possibly make itself into a flower before I had to leave the country and was going to miss the last act of the play. The hyacinth was very nice and very sincere, but it was incapable of getting all the way to being a flower without going through all the necessary stages that are required to transition from what it was to what it would become, to realize its full potential. It simply could not get there except stage by stage by stage by stage. And in our spiritual lives, in our awareness of our own potential, sometimes we imagine that we can get there somehow by skipping everything in between. And oftentimes that's a convenient fiction, because if we set for ourselves an impossible task and then consistently fail at it, we get to quit. We get to say, this is impossible, I don't have to do this. Whereas the actual process of putting out one shoot at a time, one little green leaf, gradually the plant coming into the whole flower, it simply has to be done patiently. The phrase is, with the patient application of willpower, we just go step by step by step. But this brings me back to where I was going to go just a moment ago. Sometimes it's not always clear to us what we ought to do next. And Swamiji created for us a template. Oops, am I completely gone? Okay. Are we back? No. Pardon me? If I lose this, you mean? Yeah. If I lose this, it's too grim to consider, so let's see. Let's see what's happening. No, there it is. It's back again. Who can say? All right. I'll say it. A certain curse follows me around with these things. I thought I left it on the other side of the ocean, but maybe it hid in my suitcase. Do you think it's something down here? Oh, you're afraid I'm going to fall off. Okay. No, I actually know where my feet are, but let's not be foolish here. It would decrease my magnetism to fall on my face. I think a person who doesn't have enough sense to stay on the stage is not someone you should listen to. So I'll back up here. I was with Swami Kriyananda once, and he was speaking, and his chair was actually much closer to the edge than he thought. And just in the middle of a sentence, his chair just completely fell off. He fell off with it, but he was wearing a microphone like this. He didn't even break his thought. He just fell off the stage, continued what he was saying, stood back up and went back on. It's just like he wasn't thinking about anything. I don't think I could do that, so I think I'll just stay on the stage. In any case, I was saying, Swamiji has given us a very interesting template as a way to understand spiritual progress, and I want to try to explain that to you here this evening, and I hope it helps you. He talked about we all evolve through 4 stages. And you should understand that these 4 stages are not like, I completely finish this one, I completely finish this one, I completely finish that one. We are, sometimes we like to think of ourselves, to use a sports analogy. We think of our consciousness as a long-distance runner. Just one person sort of scantily clad, going hill and dale, and that's our consciousness. But it's more accurate to think of us as an entire soccer team. I mean, each of us as an individual, all the different phases of our consciousness are like all the players on the field and all the players on the bench. Some of them are extremely talented, and that part of you can just streak ahead and score goal after goal. Some parts of us, never get off the bench. We barely know how to tie our shoes. It's just one piece of our consciousness. We don't evolve consistently. And this is one of the things we have to understand both about ourselves and about all the people around us. As Swami Kriyananda once said to me, if I expected perfection of my friends, he said, I would be a very lonely man. And he said it's very tempting to think if this friend only had the qualities of that friend, and if this one only had this. He said everybody has something that is advanced and not advanced in them. So when I speak of these 4 stages of development, we have to apply them to ourselves, all of them, depending on the day of the week or the situation we're working with. And what these represent is what I was saying, is increasing stages of awareness from a complete, we're past the age of children. we can open our drawer and we're not really so excited every time we see the socks. The socks are usually there and it's not such an event. We generally can find our mouth when we want to eat. We no longer try to feed ourselves through our heads or our ears. We can dress ourselves, all of those things. But in the art of living, in the art of being happy, in the art of courageously expanding our awareness, knowing that in ever a greater awareness lies our true satisfaction. Because when we look, as I started earlier talking about using children as an example, ever greater awareness, I have to add the word that we gradually discover that our satisfaction and fulfillment in life comes from ever greater awareness. Even though we don't know that at the beginning, and these stages of development are stages of ever greater awareness, from defining ourselves entirely by the sensations that come through our physical body and are the easiest and the cheapest form of pleasure, to the noble understanding that what we're really looking for comes from our attunement with God and our selfless service. And our society still recognizes that. We honor those who have more energy, more creativity, and who use their energy and creativity in the most noble manner. We admire that. And we aspire to it, although we don't always know how to get there. So the first stage of growth is what we call morally asleep. Okay? This is the stage in which a person is completely defined by their physical reality. And that physical reality causes them to be entirely self-centered. There's just no awareness of other people or the consequences of my actions on other people. I had a very interesting discussion this morning with two friends, one of whom is a lawyer and the other is a judge. And we were having a conversation about people who commit crimes and how often even people who do horrendous things have no idea that anybody was affected. Because in this sense, they're morally asleep. They live entirely defined by their own self-centered interests. Now, such people, their basic attitude toward life, you would say, is one of indifference. They're not really motivated to do anything. They're just indifferent to the consequences of their own actions. You might even say unaware of it. And the only thing that motivates them at all is the fear of punishment, of things getting worse. You know, somebody who's very, very lazy, and you may have someone you know who is like this, who's very lazy. The only way to motivate them is to threaten them with punishment. Sometimes children are like this, and you can't appeal to their noble instincts because they don't have any. You can only threaten to punish them. And their thought, and this is how growth is measured, and this is where all of us creep into this level in one way or another. When such a person experiences pain, he doesn't try to solve that pain by expanding his awareness. For example, if someone treats him unkindly, he doesn't try to think, what might be motivating him to treat me unkindly? What might I have done to draw this to me? What karmic lesson might be there? None of that. When such a person experiences pain, he thinks only of dulling his consciousness so he won't have to feel it anymore. In other words, it's the opposite of expanding awareness, it's shrinking it. Such people drink alcohol, overeat, too much sugar, watch television, sleep, or just blank out. Now, that's the lowest stage of development. We're talking about learning your life lessons. What I'm providing you now is the template of what all lessons in life are about. Assuming that we go from lack of awareness to infinite awareness, in the morally asleep stage, whenever we suffer, we believe that the way to deal with it is to become smaller and more contracted and less aware. So when we're working with ourselves, whenever we see this tendency, we have to realize that that is moving ourselves backward to the lowest level of awareness, And sooner or later, our own compelling inner urge to expanded consciousness is going to force us beyond that. Now we see this illustrated in the most exaggerated examples, which is alcoholics or drug addicts, or people who just are not motivated to do anything. They're indifferent. You should support the family. Why should I support the family? You should work for a good cause. Why should I work for a good cause? There's just no energy moving. And you can't motivate a person like that by appealing to their idealism, because they haven't risen to the level of awareness where there's any satisfaction in idealism. That requires a certain refinement. Now, sometimes with ourselves, and this is just working with yourself, you have a deadline at work, you have a project that you have to get done, you have housework that just seems so mundane, you can't bear to deal with it. Maybe the only way you can motivate yourself is threat of punishment. And to impress upon your mind the terrible negative consequences that will come to you if you don't do this. It's helpful to understand how these trends work. Now, in terms of a life lesson, it could have all kinds of forms, but every form is individual. But the way you can tell is, how am I responding to this? Am I just inert unless people threaten to punish me? Do I have a job, for example, where I'm completely indifferent, which is the attitude of the morally asleep person? I'm indifferent to excellence. Sometimes you meet, bureaucrats who are just absolutely indifferent to the welfare of the people, indifferent to doing a good job. The only thing that will get them to move is the threat of punishment. Maybe they'll lose their job if they don't just do a little bit. And if you find yourself in that position, no matter what's causing it, if the reaction coming out of you is to try to dull your consciousness, you realize you're acting like a morally asleep person, and that's not the stage of life you want to be in. The stage after that, now this is also what's so interesting about this, is you see this is directional. From moral asleep, we rise to the level of being self-centered. Because if we're self-centered, our basic attitude toward life becomes, what can I get for myself? But you see, that's a step up from just being indifferent. What can I get for myself? Now, there's still no idealism. There's no thought, how can I grow? How can I serve? But a person moving from morally asleep will begin to become active if there's something that will benefit him. And so if you're working with someone who is completely indifferent, you entice them by showing them that there's something in it for them. I'll give you an example. Children go through all these stages, and they're so completely open about the way they express themselves. They don't have any sense of covering up, that you can often watch it acted out. Swami Kriyananda was taking some photographs of people in the community, and there was this one family with 3 children. Actually, it was the same little boy who showed me his socks, as it happened. And there was this family with 2 older girls and this young boy, very attractive family. He wanted a family portrait. Well, the child, the 2 girls were all dressed up and they were totally ready. They were really into having their picture taken. The boy crawled way under the bed and would not come out. Absolutely, he was totally uninterested. They tried to appeal to his nobler nature. The whole family is doing it. They tried to say Swami Kriyananda is taking the picture, but nothing. He was indifferent. He had no interest. He didn't want to increase his awareness. He was under the bed and he was going to stay there. Swami Kriyananda bent over and he said, I just got some chocolate from Switzerland, and if you let me take your picture, I'll give it to you. And he came right out from under the bed. He saw that he was in the state of being morally asleep, but if he appealed to his self-interest, he would put out energy. So the child came right out from under the bed, did everything perfectly, and then demanded the chocolate, right? For the mother, it was actually very interesting, because she'd been trying to motivate that child the way she motivated her two older girls who had a different state of mind, who could easily be motivated by the level higher, which is truth-seeking and willing to be motivated by ideals, but he was only self-interested. From then on, she paid him to do the right thing. All through his life, his young life, she paid him to do the right thing. He eagerly did the right thing because there was something in it for him. And then gradually, because you see this is how evolution takes place, we learn from our own experience. Because it really isn't as enjoyable to just dull your consciousness as it is to put out energy. Even though when we're first sort of coming out of that, we think, if I'm just drunk all day, if I just watch television all day, if I just hate my job and do as little as possible, that's how I'm going to feel the best. But something inside of us knows that's not true. Just like little children want to grow up, our soul nature, maybe not always our ego mind, but our soul nature knows that self-expansion is really the key to happiness. So if we can motivate ourselves, motivate our children, motivate the people around us, according to what actually will work and cause us to have greater and greater experiences, experience itself will teach us. So speaking of this particular child, he gradually began to realize it was fun to help his family. It was fun to be involved in the family. And then he gradually began to be less concerned about what was in it for him. Now, self-concerned people also, at the self-centered stage, the way they try, when pain comes into their life, the way they try to avoid pain is by getting control of the world around them. Now, the morally asleep person just tries to blank out. This isn't really happening. Now, understand, extremely, highly refined, very educated, capable people can still become morally asleep in terms of how they deal with pain. Just like what I was saying, we're a whole soccer team. We're not just one. Maybe there's a personal situation or a truth about a family member or a situation at work that we just don't want to face. We just go blank on it. We just try to dull our awareness. And the way the self-centered person tries to deal with pain is he tries to control the whole world around him. Self-centered people in this phrase are often very energetic because the desire to get out and get what I want is often a hugely moving factor. The morally asleep person has discovered that if I put out a little energy, I get more for me. And so their motto in life is, what's in it for me? And they're often perfectly willing to do a lot of work as long as there's something in it for them. And if there isn't, forget it. And it doesn't matter about ideals. You say to such a person, maybe you shouldn't manufacture that particular kind of insecticide because it's poisoning the water system. Such a person would respond, well, if I didn't do it, somebody else will. It's like there's no sense of moral responsibility, just I can make a lot of money. It's a good deal. But once you begin to understand that by my own action I can get for myself, that thought begins to spread out. So I want to own my own house. I want to have a lot of money in the bank. I want all the people in my life to behave in a certain way. You're my husband, this is what you're supposed to do. You're my wife, this is what you're supposed to do. You're my son, this is what you're supposed to do. And such a person is being perfectly sincere from their point of view. The way they deal with what causes them pain is they line up the whole world and they force it to stay in line. And they'll often put out a lot of energy to do that. Of course, the problem is that the world does not obey a self-centered person's whim. Merely because they think that they can avoid pain by controlling the world, experience tells us that we can't. And our experience becomes our teacher. But we learn by trying. Okay? And all of us, again, will find there's areas of our lives where we deal with pain by blanking out, or we deal with pain by trying to force the world to conform to what we want it to do. Experience tells us this doesn't work. So then we move up to the third level of understanding, which is called seeking the truth. And that comes to us when we've had enough experience in life that all of a sudden we begin to really ask questions on a much deeper level. And we don't even ask those questions until we've been through a certain amount of experience. Dulling our consciousness doesn't work. Forcing the world to conform to our desires doesn't work. You know, things happen like war and economic collapse and unexpected death, and all kinds of things happen. And it startles us, and then we start asking the question, what is true? We become a truth seeker, not merely a self-centered person or a morally asleep. What is really true? Where does my happiness come from? And then the thought begins to cross our mind, which we actually accidentally discover as self-centered people, that there's a certain pleasure not only in taking care of myself, but in taking care of others. I had a friend, and he and his whole family, they owned they sold cars, and they had very, very high level. They're a very well-to-do family. They had many places where they sold cars, and he was very trained by his family. You know, you expanded your identity to your family, but then the whole family was self-centered. That was what you did. You made money for the family. And he got involved with our teaching, and he began to think on a slightly higher level, and he gave several of us cars. He gave me a car, a very nice car, which I still drive. And I was so touched by what he said after he gave me this car, and I drove off with it, and I was so happy. He said, "Gee, it feels good to give things away." He sort of said like that. Maybe I should do it more often. Somehow, after all that training, just to think about what was in it for him, it just crossed his mind that he could expand his reality to include me, for example. And the reason he gave it to me is because of the work that I do. I don't make much money what I'm doing. He makes a lot of money. I make very little, so he would give me a car. And that's when we begin to ask, maybe there's another reality here. We either learn because our success proves to us that we can do more. We suddenly have something to share. We discover the pleasure of that. And then we ask, well, what is really true? Is it what I get or what I give? And then the question becomes, how can I serve? How can I expand myself? How can I define myself by something larger? And the truth seeker begins to run his life by moral principles. And that's the point at which you ask the question, not merely, can I make a lot of money doing this, but am I doing good in what I'm doing? Or even, am I making money in such a way that I'm actually doing harm? And is that worth it to me? And how do I balance all those different factors? It's a complete waste of time to talk to morally asleep people or completely self-centered people about high principles. And in a reverse sort of way, one of the problems, at least in the American educational system, and I suspect it's the same over here, our educational system is designed for children who have to be punished in order to be motivated, or children who have to be selfishly rewarded in order to be motivated. But a person who has become a truth seeker, whose evolution is about what's right, how can I serve, it's insulting to be said, to be told, you know, if you do this, you're going to get a lot of money. If you do this, you're going to get a lot of praise. You think, that's demeaning. I would do it because I want to, because it gives me joy to do it, because I want to be part of a greater reality. And it's very, very important, both as a society and as families, to recognize who's living with us and to move them in an appropriate way. Ananda actually has our own school system. living wisdom school, we call it. And one of the fundamental principles of that is to understand the actual level of consciousness of the children in the school, and to inspire and guide them according to what will actually, for them, be the right life lesson. And in one classroom, you will threaten one with punishment, you'll promise another one a personal reward, and another you will simply invite to do it because, after all, it's the right thing and everyone in the classroom will benefit. And if each person, individually or in our relationship with others, is always looking directionally, what is the life lesson here? Where am I in regard to this? Now, what happens when we become truth seekers? We've already understood that, just dulling my mind doesn't work. Just watching television every night really doesn't bring me happiness. We've understood that no matter how hard we try, the world has an annoying way of just wiggling out from under our control. And we begin to realize that the only reality we actually can influence is our own internal state of consciousness. And that the real battle is not to make the world conform. The real battle is to gain mastery over my own reactions, over my own responses, over my own painful dependence on external conditions for my satisfaction or my happiness. Now, once we reach this stage, this is the stage when real spiritual growth begins, because we no longer blame the world for our experiences. We recognize that what's happening to me is within my own control. And then we become truth seekers. We begin to go out and try to find out how to do this. That's what brings us to spiritual teachings, to self-development places, even just to the physical fitness gym. I don't feel vitality, I don't feel energy, I need to do something with myself. But above all, we begin to realize that the only battle that has ever been worth fighting is the one of our own inner consciousness. This is the field of Kurukshetra, on which the Kauravas and the Pandavas war at all times. The selfish downward pull to selfish thinking. The Kauravas just wanted the kingdom for themselves, and the Pandavas wanted to rule it nobly. And there was a war between them. And that's the field on which we stand, because the transition from self-centered to truth-seeking is when the warrior must get engaged. That's the point at which true, dedicated self-effort begins. When I asked my uncle, "Do you enjoy reliving all the things that make you angry?" And he said, "Yes." It was quite clear to me that there was just nothing else to do after that. It wasn't even that he had the mental capacity, but he might have felt it. This is not making me happy. You need to gain some mastery over your own inclination to just relive and relive and relive and relive. But he wasn't ready. His life experience hadn't taught him that yet. He'd lived his whole life that way. He was going to die that way. He has a few more incarnations before he has to realize that just living in that self-created suffering is worse than the effort required to gain mastery and to become other than that. And then this is where, as I said, this is where real spiritual life begins. And so the way a truth-seeking person deals with pain says, what can I learn? How can I change? And then how can I use what I learn to serve others? We, as I was saying earlier, we vacillate all the time among these. Now, the fourth stage of development is truth knowing. And truth knowing is completely different because, for example, what causes us pain in our lives is the belief that things ought to be other than they are. If we really think about it, circumstances simply are. All of life ends in death. Societies are unstable. everything is waves on the ocean. The man who is rich today is not rich tomorrow. I come to India periodically. I always liked Kingfisher Airlines. I have some of their pens still, and I see now they're in bankruptcy. You know, the last time I was here, they were the best airline, and they were really the greatest to fly, even though they were expensive, and now they're in bankruptcy. I just sort of saw that in the paper, and I thought, waves go up, waves go down. You know, yesterday they're the darling, today they're not. Whoever's fault it was, whether they did it on purpose, it's not really anything I even need to know, except waves go up, waves go down. Isn't that so? And if we want things to be other than they are, now if we understand that life is just a challenge to ever-increasing awareness, and every time we feel pain, we have the opportunity to solve it in a way that moves us into greater awareness, or to solve it in a way that either holds us where we are or moves us backwards, then everything in life becomes very interesting. Because instead of it always being a conflict between what is and what we want it to be, it simply is. So at the stage of truth knowing, there is no pain. Oops. There is no pain, except nobody knows that because I just knocked it off. There we go again. Does somebody just have to kneel there and hold the button the whole time? Okay. I only have a few more minutes to go. Okay, Daya, thank you. At that level of awareness, there's no pain, because whatever comes is just an opportunity to expand awareness. And so why should I rebel? Why should I even call it suffering? Swami Kriyananda said many years ago, I've always remembered it, he said, the only certainty in life is change. Most people do not like change, therefore most people suffer. And I've had countless opportunities in the years both to witness it and to watch it in myself. Oops. I have to. No, we have nothing. There we go. I really have to say to all of the technical people here, this is not your fault. This is the karma I bring with me. So please be kind to them. It's because I have a little voice and a lot to say. This is the way that I am tormented. But you see how calmly I accept change, and I strive only to control myself in the context of it. But really what I'm saying is, when this was about what are your life lessons and how to learn them, everything that happens to us is an opportunity for us to test ourselves against these premises. Am I just going to try to hide from it and think if I dull my consciousness? Am I going to try to force the world to be something it doesn't want to be? Am I instead going to look inside myself and ask, what kind of energy can I draw forth to solve this? Either by calm acceptance, by dynamic response. It's by no means, even at the level of truth seeker, the right action to master our own impulses is by no means a passive one. Many times the answer is to go forward with absolute strength. When Swami Kriyananda was in the process of building the first Ananda community, when he had very little help and was having to do almost all of it himself, he was earning all the money to buy land and to build buildings, and he was teaching classes every night in a different city, and he would have to drive hours every day to teach. And then on the weekends, he would go to the land he was buying, he would give weekend retreats, and he was dictating books and just working so hard for quite a long time. And then somebody saw a way to try to file a legal action and get the land away from him. Somebody hadn't met their side of the contract. Swami refused to pay them the money, so they filed a lien in court to get possession of the property. Swami's position was strong, but his position was also jeopardized, and he needed $2,800 or some sum of money, which in 1970 was significant. And he was driving home with a friend, and the friend tried to comfort him and said, "Oh, just come to my house and have a cup of tea. Okay, this is a difficult problem, just solve it by just sort of shrinking back with a cup of tea, and we just won't think about it for a while. We'll pretend you'll feel better," is what she said to him. And he looked at her and he said, "I don't want to feel better, I have to solve this problem." And then he went forward with even more dynamic energy. It was he experienced the pain, but the response was, what is true? What can I do? How can I serve? I have to save this project. And he did everything he could, and just remarkably, somebody he didn't even know just wrote him a check, gave him a donation. He didn't have any expectation even that it would come. But he did everything he could to master his own fear, to recognize that I can't stop this, I can't make it different, so I will rise to the occasion. Now, truth knowing, if it comes to me, it's for my best welfare. You know, these are naive statements that people say, and they become what I call true but irrelevant philosophy at certain points. When somebody tries to comfort you with a platitude, when a platitude isn't what you want to hear, but it becomes a platitude because it's true. Because in fact, everything happens as an opportunity for us to have the chance to raise our awareness and flow with it. The truth knower doesn't experience any pain because there is no opposition to reality. You can call that no opposition to God's will, which when we know truth on its deepest level, that's how we would say. Why would I want anything other than what God sends me? Because I'm no longer looking for the lowest energy alternative and to blank myself out. I just want to know what's true, and I want to master myself to be able to meet it. Now, what I find wonderful about seeing it in this directional, progressive way is that we always can find a way to go forward. And it's much easier to understand how to go forward, because sometimes we think that the lesson is for us to behave in a certain way. But it's not the external behavior that defines whether or not we're learning and going forward. It's whether or not that action is an increase of awareness. Some people who are seemingly very harmonious and nothing ever bothers them and they're always nice are actually just morally asleep, in the sense that they're indifferent and they're not going to put out any more energy than they have to, and they believe that the way to deal with what they don't like is just to go dull. So you see people who sort of you think would be admirable, but they're really just dull. And sometimes you're progressing to be selfish. To just, what I really need to do in this situation is I need to say, no, this is what I want, and I'm going to make it happen. Because we're increasing our awareness, we're increasing our flow of energy. And even the effort to control the situation is often better than being too dull to even care, you see. But where we really need to go is to have a genuine interest in what is trying to happen and how we can help the good of all in that situation, which then requires willpower, energy, training, the patient application of willpower. The other night I was telling people that I took on a carpentry project in my own house. I did it very badly. It took me much longer than it should have taken, and even to this day it's a bit of an eyesore in the house, much to my husband's dismay. But for me it was an extremely interesting exercise. in just trying to make something happen that I really wasn't talented to make happen, just for the sheer training and applying my willpower against obstacles. And that was when I realized that everything in life is just the patient application of willpower. And if you really ask, what is every lesson there to teach you? That's what it's there to teach you. Because all of the effort required to be both patient and persevere and to put out the energy will also bring you in touch with everything else that you need to know. You know, the spiritual path, personal growth, whatever you want to call it, self-realization, appears to be very complex. And there is a very complex element to it. The philosophy, the Sanskrit terms for everything, the chakras, the kundalini, the gurus, all of these things, very, very complicated. But Swami Kriyananda made a very interesting statement once, very profound. He said, everything in creation is a manifestation of one reality. Everything emanates from Satchidananda, from one reality, and it vibrates. This is duality. This is Maya. You know, there are always two forces. Everything in the world, the waves go up, the waves go down. You have youth, and then you have old age. You have birth, you have death, you have sunlight, you have darkness, you have winter, you have summer. Everything is dual, because everything vibrates from one still point. If you have a tuning fork and you hold it, there's no sound. If you shake it or rap it against something, it begins to vibrate, and all of a sudden the sound comes. That's the fundamental sound of Om in this vibration. The more you're involved in the movement, the more you're involved in the waves on the surface, the more extraordinarily complex everything is. But the closer you come to the source, you see everything gets simpler and simpler. The movement becomes much less, and the extremes become less, the variations become less. So Swamiji put it simply, and it's a phrase that's been said before, the world of creation, of Maya, is very complex, but God is very, very simple. Because once you're standing at the center, you see that it's all made from the same reality. That's why the saints have such a simple, childlike attitude toward life, and there's such a confusing combination of enormous wisdom and sophistication, and yet this simplicity that eludes the rest of us. I've lived much of my life in the company of Swami Kriyananda, absolutely brilliant. He's written 150 books. I mean, you can hardly read 150 books. He's written them, and they're not simple books. I mean, they're not simplistic books. They're deep, they're complicated, they're scriptural commentary. Well, there's a lot of them on the wall over there. But his own inner bhav is just a little boy with Divine Mother. And when you're with him, you suddenly feel not this weight of complexity, but this, oh, it's so simple, isn't it? We just live in the presence of the Spirit, and that makes us so joyful. We become truth-knowing. There's no opposite, so there's no pain. There's just what is, and what is blissful. Now, in our personal lives, wherever we are in our spiritual evolution, we need to keep clarity on this point. Personal growth, the spiritual path, the lessons that life gives us to learn may not be easy, but it's still very, very simple. We mustn't think because it's not easy, it's complicated. Because if we think it's complicated, then we never really have to do anything. We can just be confused. But if we recognize that it's very simple, then all we have to do is just come back. And this long story that I've been telling you about the directional way that we develop. Am I hiding from truth? Am I accepting it? Am I trying to change myself and use my God-given energy to move forward to serve others? Or am I shrinking back into myself and trying to hide from reality? Am I angry at what happens? Or do I recognize that God gives me what I need, and He will also give me the power to follow it? Keep the principles very, very simple. And then, even if it's not easy to do, the path is very clear in front of you. And with the patient application of willpower, what happens with greater awareness is the more aware we are, the more we become aware of that divine reality within us, which is the perfect bliss for which we were born. That's the promise of all the masters. That is the promise that will be fulfilled in your life, one step at a time. God bless you.